Good morning. Thank you so much for being here. I know it's not easy to get here early in the morning, so I really appreciate you sharing your start to the day with me. I'm Sonya. Most of my clients know me as Spaghetti Head, and my friends know me as Soy. I'm honoured to be speaking here on Turrbal and Jagera land this morning, and thrilled to be speaking on a theme that is definitely in my wheelhouse as a food writer, and that theme is spicy. So thank you to our self-proclaimed crazy idiot, hardworking host Tamara for having me. A little about what I do. I write about life's greatest pleasures, so namely food, travel, and other fanciful things. As a food writer and recipe editor, it's safe to say there's usually one thing on my mind, and it's food. To me, spice is particularly important, not only in my work, I can't imagine having to write about flavourless food, but also in my approach to life. Variety, it has been said once or twice now, is the spice of life. And this spice is precisely what's led me here. Excuse me, scrolling through my notes, it's early. My creative path has been one full of zigs and zags and some hurdles, mostly of my own making. And yet without that variety and spice, I'm certain my writing would lack any flavour. Speaking of zigs and zags, as 5 powerful philosophers of the 1990s once said, people of the world spice up your life. And while some of their choices may have dated and then come back again, I think that advice still stands. Variety, thus spice, brings flavour and joy to our lives. As a freelance writer, Tamara's kind of gone through my story anyway, but as a freelance writer, I've had the pleasure of writing stories for a variety of print and digital publications. This is an illustration that my beautiful friend Anya Lang, who is a Brisbane designer, created for me, and I think it encapsulates what I do. I like to say, I turn your alphabety spaghetti into copy you won't forgetty. My words have been published across the pages of these magazines and many more. I also write food and travel reviews, edit recipes for taste.com.au, interview chefs and producers, etc., among other less exciting things like invoicing. And I'm also the mum of 2 small humans who are teaching me a lot about creativity, but are far less conducive to getting writing done and sleeping, for example. Wow, I didn't think about how big that photo was going to be when it was up here. Under the name Spaghetti Head Services, I write copy for mostly food and drink focused folk, who are of course the best kind of people. My clients have ranged from beekeepers to oyster shuckers to chocolatiers, and then there's tourism bodies, eco-travel booking sites, hotels, restaurants, and more. But growing up, I had no idea that these kind of gigs existed, and possibly some of them didn't exist at the time. I just knew that I loved writing stories. Was that my mum saying, oh? Yeah, it was. Throughout my childhood, as many of us do, I wrote a lot of stories, and a lot of them ended in, and then I woke up and it was all an amazing dream. In high school, I continued to write lots of stories and really awful songs and tragic poems and letters. And I really looked forward to my English assignments as well, genuinely, which I think says a lot. In fact, I had a crush in my English class, and he looked a lot like Seth Cohen from the OC, the Millennial Dream. And I would compete with him to get top marks in my class, and he's still here today, and 20 years later, he's still critiquing my short stories. It's my husband, in case that wasn't clear. Possibly my harshest critic, actually. In grade 12, I also I was my yearbook editor, and I did work experience at Dolly magazine, which was every teen girl's dream. It wasn't the 80s, I just really liked that cover. So I loved the world of writing and the editorial world, and so naturally, soon after finishing high school, I enrolled, of course, in a natural medicine degree. Variety is the spice of life, as they say. And while I liked learning about medicinal herbs, as I'm sure many teenagers do, I found that when I was supposed to be studying sort of chemistry and biology, I was writing stories instead, and terrible songs and terrible poems, of course. And it dawned on me fairly soon in that my mind's not oriented toward the sciences, nor logic, it would seem. And so then I became a natural medicine school dropout. And for kind of quite a few years after that, I took on a series of maybe like 20 comically ill-fitting jobs. I worked at theme parks, despite the fact that I'm scared of heights. I worked at a lot of health food stores, selling a lot of horny goat weed to older men. And again, every teenage girl's dream. And I sold gym memberships, even though I was really shy and not really into gyms as well. As you can probably tell, I say yes to a lot of things without putting any thought into it. And while I don't advise you live your life this way, it does lead to some spicy misadventures. After sort of those years of taking on those silly jobs, I decided I should go to uni for whatever reason and get a degree. And so I studied a Bachelor of Arts in Linguistics and studied multiple languages, which again is a slight detour off the path to becoming a writer. And then we moved to Japan, as you do, which was another spicy misadventure. Osaka, where we moved, was very different to Mianji in Brisbane at the time, so it opened up a real new world for me. I'd only ever lived in Brisbane, and it opened up a new world of food as well. So during my time in Japan, I sort of as a rite of passage, I guess, taught English, and I sang a lot of nursery rhymes to elementary school children. And I think it was kind of during my 20th time in a day singing head, shoulders, knees and toes that I started to wonder if I could be a writer instead and if writing could be a job that I could do. I'll just pause for gasps. I finally came to that realisation. So when we returned back to Mianji in Brisbane, I enrolled in a Master of Arts in Writing, Editing and Publishing. So I love this question because it reframes for me what's the worst that could happen. Because if you ask an anxious person what's the worst that could happen, we could fill a book, right? Like we could give you 20 answers to that. But what if it all works out as a nice optimistic spin? So after years of faffing around, from that very first creative writing class, I feel like I'd found my people and my thing. And I'm not suggesting at all that you need a degree to be a writer. I really don't think you do. Writers write and artists make art. But for me, it was really life-affirming to be part of a creative community of wannabe writers like myself and to make those connections in person. And of course, there's many ways you can do that, including coming to Creative Mornings Brisbane without needing to take on formal study. During that time, I took on a bunch of internships and wrote for a ton of blogs, because blogs were the future at the time. I think that future has since passed, unfortunately. But the most important thing from my story, I think, is that I never waited for opportunities or gigs to come my way. I'm just too impatient for that. So I always, pitched to editors, I cold emailed people, I set up coffee dates, and did things that made me feel really uncomfortable to make connections because I knew that I didn't have an established network or a portfolio, and so it had to happen. Networking is not something that comes naturally to most people, and it wasn't for me, but it was an important part of my path. But once I started writing, I just couldn't be stopped. I just wrote and wrote and wrote. I absolutely loved it, and it just lit this fire within me. It was almost like a compulsive thing. And to my delight, a lot of people were willing to connect. I think that's something great about the Brisbane creative community. People are willing to give emerging writers and artists a leg up if you make yourself known. So soon enough, I got my first full-time writing job at the Weekend Edition, which is still thriving today. And they had a print publication at the time called Map Magazine. And working there was fantastic because even though I was kind of writing at this feverish pace that probably only a 25-year-old can, I was able to learn so much about editing my own work and taking on feedback and sort of doubling as a photographer and doing all these sorts of things that you do across startups and small businesses. So I think the most exciting thing of all was that Brisbane's food and drink scene was really starting to blossom at that time, and so it was a really great opportunity to meet people doing cool things across this city. I feel like I'm giving my own eulogy a little bit. Just play this back at my funeral. In the years that followed, I launched a new magazine for UQ called Changemakers, and then I launched my own magazine called Little Wren, which was aimed at kind of most predominantly teenage girls, alongside my great friend Georgia Lejeune, who's another Brisbane creative. And we started a website and we ran workshops, and we were kind of a space for emerging artists and writers to get their first little break online and to get that experience. And so we sort of exchanged skills and edited their work and created this beautiful publication, and it was really fun to do things from the ground up. And I know a lot of the young women that we featured in the publication have spoken on this stage as well, so it's really cool to see. Next, because I can't sit still for long, obviously, I took my restless mind and bag of tricks to London with no job or home prospects. Fortunately, I thought I'd end up sort of working in a bar or something, which is fine, but I don't know how to do that. I landed a job at an agency writing copy for a lot of big brands, which was really cool because I hadn't done much of that before. And London for me felt like the kind of city where anything could happen, and a lot of things did happen. I started to get freelance commissions without really needing to pitch. I collaborated with so many different people that I met. You know, I'd go to a supper club and sit next to a ceramicist and end up working on a project with them. Or there was a really great community vibe, which there is here as well. So I really immersed myself in that creative scene and made a lot of lifelong friends, of course. And I ate and travelled as if it was my life's work, but I didn't know that it was actually about to become my life's work. On one of my sort of cold emails, I contacted a chef whose work I admired, and we met for a cider in a cosy pub in East London, and it turned out that she was launching, I think she called it a digital lifestyle magazine, like a editorial website type thing, and we had a mutual friend in Brisbane. And that night she offered me a job on the spot as her editor of her lifestyle publication. That's Rachel Koo up there. For me, that is a great lesson in putting yourself out there, because I really think if you don't contact people and let them know that you're enthusiastic and available, they're not going to know that you exist. So for me, contacting people is really important. And as an editor, I've had the same thing. People will contact me and say, hey, I'm available, I'm experienced in this. And, you know, I make a note of that and often come back and give them work later. So it feels gross to self-promote, but it actually works. So while working for Rachel, I kind of developed my niche in food and travel writing. She was based in Sweden and I was in London, so I hosted events on her behalf. I did radio interviews and hosted a podcast and had lots of shoots in my home. And I got to work with some of the best, the culinary talents of London, you know, world-renowned food photographers and stylists and food editors. And I was really starstruck by every one of my colleagues. You can see one of the food shoots happening in my home, in my small London apartment there. I probably had an Aussie backpacker sleeping on the floor at the same time. So I got to come up with culinary concepts for big brands, and I got to learn how to edit recipes and things. So that was really when I fell in love with food and travel writing. A couple of years later, my husband and I moved to Sydney. We had a bit of a swift departure due to health reasons, which is a long story. And when I got to Sydney, I landed some not-so-fun jobs at the start, one of which I think I lasted in 2 weeks before I had to tell them I was not their person. I tried to fit into kind of the corporate atmosphere and failed miserably. But again, variety is the spice of life, right? And it's all fodder for the book. So fortunately, during this not-so-joyous time in our lives, I mustered all the enthusiasm I had and gathered that sort of what-the-hell attitude again and convinced Donna Hay to give me a job. And I'd, again, admired her for a really long time, really loved her magazine, and that was a fantastic gig. That's me up there pretending to have straight hair. There I got to taste test food to write about, edit recipes. I was a ghostwriter for Donna and took home a lot of cake, which is obviously a great perk of that job. And again, worked with these really talented people. And I actually didn't think a better job existed. But then I ate my words. 6 months in, the magazine ended, which was a real bummer. We were all made redundant, which I think is an important milestone if you work in publishing, particularly for a big publisher. But don't feel too sorry for me, because that's when I actually discovered that a better job did exist. And that's when I was appointed the travel editor at Delicious magazine. I mean, it's a tired cliche about, one door closing and another door opening. Doesn't always work out that way. But in this case, I was available to take on this new job. So travelling in pursuit of good food suddenly became my professional vocation. As a travel editor of Delicious, there's me looking very comfortable on a yacht. It was my job to jet set across the globe in pursuit of, great food in beautiful locations. Terrible job. I was spoiled in these luxurious locations to the point of rotting. As someone who loves camping and grew up in Brisbane semi-rural south, on Quandamooka land, it was an insight into a world of private jets and super yachts that I didn't know existed. For example, I was flown from my Sydney office to the Whitsundays for lunch and back on occasion. Helicoptered to private wineries for the day, stayed in ridiculous accommodation. You can see Mauritius and Athens and Crete and where were we? Indonesia, all over the shop. Portland, London. I ate at some of the world's best restaurants, went to wildly opulent parties most nights of the week, and was sent ridiculous gifts every day. Sometimes I was even dressed for events, which is a really, really uncomfortable and bizarre thing. It was embarrassingly decadent and every bit ludicrous. It really feels like one of those stories that should end in, then I woke up and it was all an amazing dream. But the photos tell me that it did happen. Of course, as someone who's happiest sleeping in a tent, I'd be lying if I said I didn't feel like a big phony a lot of the time. That did change one night a little bit for me, because I remember I was at one of these kind of opulent dinner parties at one of those harbourside restaurants like Key or Benelong or somewhere, and there was this very well-dressed older man next to me, and he worked at one of the most prestigious magazine titles in the world, that's Vogue, and I found out that he grew up in Capalaba, and that made me feel a little bit better, like I wasn't the only Redlands kid in the room. And yeah, it's just a lesson in that nobody's born doing amazing things. So having grown up away from this type of lifestyle, I think is what gave me that kind of critical eye that I could apply to my work and stopped me from getting a giant ego, which is pretty easy to do in that kind of job where everyone's saying yes to you. And then, of course, in 2020, world turned upside down, yada, yada, we know what happened. Travel became something people really feared. And I just had my first baby, Frida, really prematurely. And my husband and I decided it was time to move back to the warm, welcome, open arms of Meanjin, probably alongside half of Sydney and Melbourne as well. So though I'd always freelanced, this was a really great opportunity, and I launched my own copywriting business called Spaghetti Head Services during that time. What I really love about doing my own thing is that it gives you that creative freedom, the flexibility, led to a bunch of exciting projects which I wouldn't have otherwise been involved in, allowed me to become reacquainted with the Sunshine State and its incredible food and drink scene, which has just changed so much since I'd left. I mean, just look at this place and Howard Smith Wharves. None of this was here when I left. So I was really inspired about that. And I said to Tamara, I think we're all a bit troppo up here. We're not sort of defined by these tired cliches that some of Australia's other bigger cities are. We're free to evolve and define ourselves, which I think is really cool. So these days when I receive messages from people asking, how do I become a food writer or a travel writer? My first answer is, I don't know, because for me that involved, selling horny goat weed and studying herbology. And working at Tiger Island. So it's probably not the most sensical route to get to a career in writing, or the speediest, but it did lead to some spicy misadventures. How am I going for time? All right? Okay. My advice instead would be to follow your creative inklings, trust yourself, put yourself out there and get a great reputation, and ignore any naysayers, particularly the one in your own head, the loudest one of all. I realise now that what I was doing is what all writers and artists ought to do, and that is collect stories. I was gathering these rich experiences that brought variety and therefore spice into my life. I was, as those 90s icons suggested, spicing up my life. As another prophet, Julia Child, said, "The only real stumbling block is fear of failure. In cooking, you've got to have a what the hell attitude." And I just suggest that that applies to creating anything worth making. To create something spicy takes courage, but the antonym for spicy is bland. And if we consider the celebrated artists and creators of our time, we rarely remember anyone because their work was bland. For most of 2022, I was unable to consume anything except like occasional crackers and intravenous fluids. My life was utterly beige. It was without spice, and I couldn't even tolerate ginger. It was a sad time, and it made my job really difficult as well. Fortunately, my darling second baby Augie was worth the 9 months of extreme round-the-clock morning sickness, on balance, but it really made my job and my ability to live my life very difficult. So from the moment my son was born, I've been celebrating spice and flavour all over again every day. So spice for me is joy. To create art or food that makes you feel good, you need to celebrate your voice, your spice. I was going to say every human has a flavour of their own, but that sounds a bit Hannibal Lecter, doesn't it? We'll scroll on. Just like your food preferences, every person's work has been informed by experiences throughout their lives, the good, the bad, and the spicy. It takes practice to develop your voice. For me, it's a lot like learning to cook. You don't start out with a signature dish or a signature style. Nobody's born a great cook or a great writer or a great public speaker. And that's the joy of living a creative life. You're always able to learn and progress and change. What I love most of all about food writing is that it is a gateway for endless conversations and understanding, and I assure you that leads to some spicy stuff. Having worked in food media for more than a decade now, I've learned that what we talk about when we talk about food is actually people. The people who grow it, prepare it, sell it, make it, and eat it. And by talking about what we eat, we can learn so much about people. And as a nosy person, I just love that. Being a white food writer, I'm hyper aware of what a privileged seat I'm in and how lucky I am to be exposed to the cuisines of other nations and cultures, and how lucky I am to share those stories of the people who grow, produce, and cook these foods. Ethnocentric bias is a massive problem in food media and most kinds of media. And I don't take the responsibility of writing about foods from cultures to which I do not belong lightly. So while I may be invited to critique dishes, I believe it's not for me to speak about the authenticity or rate any cuisine higher than another. I also think it's very important to acknowledge our talented and hardworking hospitality workers and creative people of Brisbane who've absolutely transformed the food scene here at all hours. Having grown up here in the 90s, I know just how far things have come, and it's thanks to these trailblazers. I really salute the hospo workers whose efforts I get to just write about and enjoy. I get the fun part. So what I'd love after you leave here today is for each of you to create something spicy for fun. Draw a funny sketch, come up with a new sandwich filling, write a silly poem, whatever it is, something that brings joy to you. Sometimes when the world feels especially heavy, as it does now, obviously, it can feel really fickle to make silly or fun things just for the joy of it. But I believe it's times like these that we need creative people more than ever. We need sensitive, thoughtful, and observant people to express themselves and document their feelings in all kinds of ways for those who can't or for those who don't know how. And just to balance out the bad with a bit of joy, you know? To kind of conclude today, I just wanted to say, create things for fun, make weird shit because you can, wear an outfit that makes you look like Beetlejuice or Austin Powers, as I've been told this morning, or a watermelon. Celebrate variety, welcome change, collect stories, and in conclusion, spice up your life. Thank you so much for having me.
Can we please thank Sonya again? That was so good, bud.